In this video, we're going to go over how you can start creating environments with Gaia. By the end of this video, you'll have the basic skills to start creating environments and exporting them to other softwares like Blender, Maya, or Unreal, or any other game engine that supports height maps. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is what you have to understand before you start creating an environment or a terrain. Creating a terrain is a procedural process, and you probably want to have a lot of reference images of the type of landscape or terrain you're wanting to create. Even if you're doing something that's more abstract or alien like, it's still good to do a little bit of research. So you want to have your concepts and a plan and approach to making something similar to your concepts or similar to your idea. In this case, I found some images of some kind of high altitude mountains and started to block out and just think about what areas are snow, what areas are grass, what areas are loose gravel or hard rock. Start breaking up your environment by figuring out what types of elements, what types of surfaces will be distributed at different angles and different elevations. Once you have that figured out, you then know what you're trying to achieve and have an idea. Next, we're going to want to start being able to break down where those different kind of materials or landscape formation types go. So in this case, the environment that I chose is more of an alpine tundra environment. It's that type of biome. It's important to understand the different biomes of the world so you kind of know how they behave. Where does water flow? How does that affect how the landscape looks, as well as the foliage that grows on the landscape? So I've broken this down to just different layers, where snow goes, where rock goes, where sparse grass and silt and smaller rocks go. And you have to start thinking about what happens at these different areas. In high altitude environments, you have a lower growing foliage because it's colder. Maybe water doesn't stick around as long. It may have a lot of changing weather, but that weather may be harsh. Whereas lower altitudes, dips, areas that may accumulate water will be more likely to have grass, shrubs, smaller trees, flowers, moss, even life, like larger animals, and not just smaller animals like birds or things that would live in more higher altitude regions. So you have to kind of think about how does your landscape, how does the biome or the type of environment affect that landscape and whatever creatures, animals, or kind of beings that live in that location or that type of area. So not only do you have to start creating an environment, but that environment will start to dictate what types of creatures, what types of plant life, and other things that will grow and kind of be based around that environment. So you start to build a story. Now, it's important to understand these different biomes that I mentioned. I have some links here that you can kind of take a look at and see the different biomes. But really, the most important thing about figuring out what type of biome you have for your environment is to make your environment believable. If you have an environment where trees are growing on the topmost peaks and then the lower areas kind of have no growth, it just doesn't feel believable. It doesn't feel like an actual proper functioning environment. So you want to make sure that the environment you're creating feels immersive, feels believable, and to do that, you kind of have to understand how the biomes of the world function. What type of creatures live there? What type of plant life live there? How does the temperature affect the plant life, the creatures, and everything that kind of grows around that type of environment? So it's important to kind of concept this out and think about it. Even if you're creating some far off alien environment, there's still going to be some sort of mechanic that allows things to function the way they do. So it's important to do this. It's important to understand these different types of geological terminologies. You need to know what erosion is. You need to know what igneous rock is. You have to know kind of how that environment functions. So it's good to understand just basic geological terms. So when you're using softwares like Gaia or other types of softwares that do terrain formation and generation, you're able to know what parameters you have to adjust. You're not going to know exactly, but if you understand some basic terminology, it'll kind of help inch you in the right direction so that you're kind of adjusting the correct sliders And if you want something to look a certain way, you know if you need to add more erosion to soften out those shapes, or you know what you have to kind of add to get the look that you want. So for example, igneous rock is when magma or molten rock cools and crystallizes. We take a look here at what igneous rock can form. It can form some impressive structures like this that almost looks fake, but that is real. So even if you're creating alien like environments, it's good to know what types of rocks would form these kind of interesting alien like shapes so that you know what kind of materials will go on those surfaces and kind of how foliage or different plant life and growth can actually even grow up those surfaces to a certain point. So it's great to get reference and just understand a little bit of the world around us to help create other worlds that may be totally made up and fantasy like, but it will help you structure that world in a way that feels more believable and that has mechanics that could support the wildlife and the type of creatures and things that you'll be adding to it. So going back, that also falls under establishing history. You create an environment, create kind of like an ecosystem and biome. It has plants, it has different things growing at different areas. That starts to develop and define the creatures. It also starts to establish a bit of a story for your world. And that story and the creatures and kind of how that geography of your environment is shaped also enforces ways that your player will navigate the world. So it's just kind of those types of hints that will tell the player where to go or what things they don't want to do, otherwise their character might not survive. If it's like a giant snowy foreign planet type of environment and all the creatures are huge, they generate a lot of heat and they seek shelter, that's going to kind of block out a bit of a story and a path for your character to follow. It's a harsh environment. Maybe they have to do what the animals do, seek kind of caves and shelter when there's a storm. So, depending on how your environment is, how you populate it, that all tells a story, which also affects how people react when they play your game. So, what about actually creating the environment? We're going to jump into Gaia and start creating some simple environments. And it's very easy. It can be as simple as adding a node that just generates some noise and then performing some erosion on it. Erosion is going to be how that kind of geography wears down over time, how water hits it and flows down its slopes and its valleys and dips and kind of carves pathways into it. It's kind of how the ground or the surface wears away over time. It erodes the surface from various things like wind, water, you know, sand or dirt moving down that environment when rain does hit it. It forms little valleys and channels. So we're going to take a look at how easy it can be to start creating a detailed environment in Gaia. So I'm going to jump on over into Gaia, and once I have Gaia loaded up and I've created a brand new scene, I have a graph here that's totally empty, I can start adding nodes. So in this case, I'm going to add something really simple. I'm just going to go down here and press tab and add a mountain. And by adding a mountain, I already start to have a bit of a structure here. And usually I work at a low resolution here, like half or 0.5K, 512 pixels by 512 pixels. If you start wanting to see more details on your environment, you can start upping that resolution, but it will take longer to generate. So usually I work at a really low resolution until I'm happy with everything, and then I'll bump it up a bit when I start adding smaller and finer details. So in this case, we're going to keep it simple. I'm going to add a mountain node, and then I'm going to do a combine. So you can combine multiple nodes together, and I'm going to create a Perlin node. Perlin is just a noise, a Perlin noise. So it looks like this. If I just view that Perlin node, if I view the mountain node, it looks like this. And if I combine those two, then I get a blend of both of them. So I can blend this either one or the other, or do a 50-50 mix, so I can add them on top of each other, or I can screen or subtract. I can start doing different kind of math operations on them to form these different environments. And maybe I'll just do a multiply and kind of add both them together, multiply both them together with just a multiply. After that, I'm going to add an erosion. So I'll press tab, erosion, and this will kind of simulate how water may fall on this environment and kind of erode away the surface and form channels and valleys and kind of wear it down. So I'm going to take this erosion node, connect it up to combine, and then already we start to get some interesting details here. Now, on top of that, we can also start to add a little bit more finer details to the surface. I can use something like a surface text or a surface texture and connect my erosion to that. And what that will do, as you can see here, it adds this little pattern. And now this is a 2D node. It's not meant to be changing the terrain in a way. So I can kind of see here there's different settings, sprinkling, there's peaks, there's splotches, different types of patterns you can kind of add. And it kind of looks at the height of your terrain and adds or filters its features to create these maps. You have like wind streaks. So maybe I'll do something like sprinkling and just add some little bumps and valleys or dips to the environment. Now I can't just plug erosion into this its texture node. It'll turn it back into a 2D texture. So in Gaia, there's two different ways that you have to start to build your environments. You have to shape the 3D, shape the height of your environment, and then that will be your kind of height map. And then you can use all that information like height and elevation and slope to distribute textures and patterns over your terrain to start creating the textural details. So you first have to create the shape and then you have to create the texture. So if I'm happy with this shape here, at my erosion node, I can right click on it and pin as underlay, and that will keep it pinned for the 3D shaping. Now I can start doing the texturing. But maybe I want to add this texture here on top of the terrain, but actually have it affect the height or the bumps in the surface. And you can do that as well. But to do that, I'm going to have to add a combine. So I'll combine. I'll take my erosion. I'll add the surface text, which is all this little fine detail, as a second input, and it'll kind of break the terrain. But what I can do then is set it to add, so it adds that detail on top. Maybe that's too much right now. So the amount I'll make it is maybe only 1%. And now it just adds this fine little detail over the terrain. So if I go back to erosion node, that's before, then combine with that surface text, 1% on add, just adds a little bit of noise to the terrain. So you can do that to add finer details as well. And again, I'm viewing this at 0.5K or 512 pixels by 512 pixel resolution right now. So it is fairly low quality. So the next thing that we're going to do is start adding color. So now this combine will become my final 3D shaping. So I'll pin that as underlay. Now I'll start doing some texturing or getting color added onto this surface. So what I'll do is I'll just grab a couple nodes that will allow me to isolate different areas easily. I'm going to add a soil node. And if I connect that to my combine, it will generate kind of the slopes of where the rain or soil would run down. And then I'm also going to create a slope node so I can isolate different angles. And if I view that one, I can kind of change the min and max and mask out different areas and even control the fall off. And then I'll add a texture node, which will give me some various breakup based on the surface, which can be used just to give us some variation like this. Kind of like a mixture of both those nodes, but in a more interesting way. It's very powerful. You have a lot of settings here. Now, even without adjusting any of those settings, I need to start taking these masks and applying color to them. So this can very easily be done. And you can do this by using something called a sat map. If I create a sat map, I think of it as like satellite map. It's like gradients captured from a satellite of different parts of the world or Earth, or even just different gradients that determine how that terrain will be shaded based on whatever mask you plug that sat map into. So if I were to use a gradient like, let's find one here, it goes from dark to kind of brighter. If I choose that sat map and I connect that sat map to the combine, which would just reference the height, you'll see it puts the bright areas at the top, dark areas at the bottom. It uses the height map of our terrain to do that texturing. If I click on the combine node and view its 2D surface, it shows it as a shaded image here, but really it's just a black and white value of dark areas are lower elevation, bright areas are higher elevation. So by plugging that into a sat map, it uses that gradient and applies it to that elevation. Now, if I apply that sat map to maybe our texture node here that has gradients based on slope, angle, height, different areas that fall off, it will take this gradient here of gray values and map these colors to it. So if I go from the texture to the sat map, there we go. Now, if I change that sat map to something more desert-like, maybe like this, we start getting some interesting shading. So I can already start to shade this environment. So in this case, I could take something like this. Maybe that's my sat map for the texture. I'll create another sat map for the slope, shade that a different way. Maybe I'll shade it with a different color. Find something in here, maybe sandy. And I could clamp these sat maps as well if I don't want certain colors being used, and change the bias, which will offset it. So maybe I'll choose something like this, then clamp it to only be more kind of sandy values. Change the bias a bit. Maybe I could reverse it or flip it. I can start adjusting these things. And you might be looking around for like a sat map that you want, and you can import your own as well. You don't have to use a sat map. You can also go in here, and there's plenty of nodes that you can use, but you can bring in your own gradients by using I believe it's a CLUTER node, and you can specify colors and use those colors to produce your own kind of gradient here. So I can add as many little sections as I want and create my own gradient and use that instead. And that could be good for generating masks as well if you want like a red, green, and blue mask to determine different elevations or slopes or things. The easy way you can do that. But going back to sat map here, I'll just choose something like this. This will be fine. And that gives me some nice kind of breakup. And now what I'll do is I'll blend these two sat maps together with something called a mixer. And so you can mix two colors together. In older versions of Gaia, it's called a mixer. Newer versions of Gaia, it's called combine. It's the same node. But whatever versions you're using, create a combine or a mixer and just mix your two sat maps together or combine them together, and then use a mask, this bottom node here. Now for the mask, I'm going to use my soil, which is that mask of this. So I'm using that as a mask to place this sat map versus this sat map. And right now it's set to blend, but if I put it at like 100%, 0%, we could see the difference, 0 and 100. Not very strong there, and right now it's set to blend. Maybe I can do like subtract or multiply, divide, and you can see how I can kind of merge those two different sat maps based on that mask to give me different looks. So something like this looks pretty cool. I probably want to play around with this a little bit more and check my references and see if it's looking like the surface I want to create. But you can start to make environments this way. And then when you're happy with something or you think you have something that looks pretty cool and you want to see it in higher quality, you can always go in here and change the resolution. So if I change it to like 1K, it'll take a bit of time to regenerate all those nodes, but by the end of it, I will see a visualization here in the viewport of much higher resolution terrain. And once you're happy with everything and you want to export it, you can mark your nodes for export. So I'd go to my combine node, which will give me my height map, and right click on it and mark for export. And maybe I'll rename it as like height map, and now mark for export. And then here, this combine node is the color I want to apply. Maybe that's my final texture. I'll rename it to color and right click mark for export. And once you've marked those for export, if you go to build, you'll see them here, color and height map. You can choose the format, the resolution, and then start the build and export it to a directory and save out those images for use in Unreal or Maya or Blender, Unity, or any other kind of game engine or software that can load in height maps and textures. Now, we'll be going over that in future videos, uh, but if you spend a bit more time creating your terrain and match it to some reference, or kind of actually study a bit of references or environments to create those terrains and figure out where the snow should go, where the grass should go, start to think about all those things, you can maybe make something a little bit more detailed. So this is an environment that I've made in Gaia in probably about 30 minutes or so, and it looks pretty good. Like it has a lot of detail. There's obviously going to be a limit. There's a lot of other things that we're going to have to do to really make this environment look believable. This is just like a skeleton or a base. On top of this, we'd start placing rocks and trees in Unreal or in a game engine or in a 3D software like Blender, but this is kind of giving us a good overall look of our terrain and start blocking in what types of surfaces go where. You can see where the grass goes, the rock, the snow. So you can start to produce pretty cool looking environments in Gaia in a very short amount of time. So play around with it, see what you can create. And once you've created something that you really like, export it, and we'll start getting it into those other softwares. So if you are subscribed on Patreon, you will get the PDF file that I have here available for download. I also go over a couple other things here, kind of what we discussed, but I also have a couple screen grabs and things of different recipes you can use in Gaia to produce different patterns. So that's all downloadable from the Patreon. But please comment below if you'd like to see more videos about Gaia and environment creation in Gaia. Let me know what kind of content and videos you would like to see, and subscribe and like this video to see more content in the future.